Thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and talk this evening and hopefully stimulate an interesting conversation. I'm quite impressed by the fact that several people have come along for a discussion about Stoicism, self-care and inequality. They're all quite challenging and interesting and complex subjects. So it's great that you're here, great that you've prioritized this, made time for it. I'm very grateful. I don't need to talk any more about myself, I think, because Eve has already introduced me very well. So I just want to explain my aims over the next 30 minutes. I'm conscious we only have 30 minutes, so I'm determined to manage that time well. I'll do that to the best of my ability. My take on these subjects has been informed by not just my own Stoic practice, but my observations about Stoicism. So I observe quite a lot of online Stoic related activity, and I'm really interested in how Stoicism effectively sells itself to the world, how it promotes itself, and how it defines itself. So I've been interested to see that there are lots of associations between Stoicism, let's say, being beneficial to CEOs, or to sports people, or to soldiers and senior military personnel. And all of those, of course, are perfectly legitimate ways of practicing Stoicism and incorporating into the lives of those individuals. It's also got a very, very powerful academic foundation and academic support. And again, very, very important, and absolutely legitimate. But not my perspective. I'm really interested more in further and wider applications of Stoicism. And that's why I want to have a brief conversation about that potential this evening. I suppose why I want to make the connection between Stoic practice and a very serious social issue that we hear more and more about, which is inequality. So I want to know whether Stoicism can do anything to counter some of the adverse impacts of inequality, particularly in relation to the kind of psychological and emotional consequences of inequality, which I saw so much of in community mental health services. So that's my perspective this evening. Can we apply the practices, the perspectives of Stoicism a little more widely than is currently the case? My belief is that we can, and I'll try and demonstrate what evidence there is to support that perspective. So this evening, I do have some specific aims. I'll go through those very, very quickly, and I won't repeat them at the end. So we know my background now. I want to give you a sense of scale in relation to the inequalities that I'm referring to. So I'll dwell upon that a bit. It's not directly related to Stoicism, but it's important that we all understand the social context of these things, and explore some ways in which, yes, Stoicism can perhaps offset some of the psychological consequences of inequalities. I'll give some examples of what I mean by that. In the absence of systemic change. So I am an optimist. That may not be immediately apparent, but I am an optimist. However, I'm also a realist. And I've created this presentation and this perspective in the expectation that nothing substantial will change in our society in terms of its relationship with inequality in the foreseeable future. So my question then is, what can we do in lieu of that change? What can we change within ourselves? So I also reflect upon some of the psychological rewards that I found can ensue from good and consistent Stoic self-care practices. I'll explore some of the different dimensions of self-care, because self-care is a kind of multi-dimensional concept, and I'll explain what I mean by that later on. I really believe that Stoicism can play a major and very effective role in relation to those dimensions of self-care. And ordinarily, the way I would do this is I have a little bit longer, and I'd explore this territory with you by asking you a series of questions to engage you in conversation or to test your knowledge. However, time is limited tonight, so with your indulgence, I'll save the questions until the end of the talk. So, excuse me while I have a sip of tea. So here's some of the context I was referring to. So my work is informed by all of this information and more, but I just thought I'd bring to your attention some of the key publications in relation to inequality that have emerged over the last decade or so. So excellent academic work. The first I've referenced there is a now quite a well-known publication, book called The Spirit Level by the epidemiologists Wilkinson and Pickett. And that reached a series of really interesting conclusions. But the one that really stands out for me as a mental health professional was that, according to Wilkinson and Pickett, if our society was as equal as some of the comparator nations in their particular study, that the demand for mental health services in the UK would decline by 50%, which is quite a staggering figure. Now, do I know whether that's categorically true or not? Well, I can't say that. We've not tried to make our society more equal, but I was certainly convinced by the evidence base. I referenced The Health Gap, another major publication in this field by a great practitioner in this field, Michael Marmot, who was a psychiatrist by training, but became an epidemiologist and has published some wonderful work. I referenced The Health Gap because of its focus and its irrefutable evidence base in terms of the relationship between wealth inequalities and health inequalities, and how they work their way through our society. In 2017, there was a major UN report which I made a microscopic contribution to on global mental health, but I was pleased to be associated with it. The report the exercise was conducted by a psychiatrist, Danius Puris, and it's worth referencing because his ultimate conclusion wasn't what you perhaps would expect it to be. His ultimate conclusion was that the greatest obstacle to improved mental health outcomes across the world is inequality. I referenced more academic work in The Inequality Effect, a very, very good book by Danny Dorling. And that book tries to imagine what our society would look like in its entirety, I think, if our society was significantly more equal than it currently is. Another great book, also by Wilkinson and Pickett, that companion document to The Spirit Level, called The Inner Level. Particularly interesting to me in the context of tonight, because that book is all about the psychological and the emotional consequences of material inequality. So taking the material side of inequality, which we naturally tend to focus upon, out of the equation, and focusing upon the psychological, the emotional impacts, which we see manifest as mental health issues within the NHS. And also a very good report called Mental Health for All, published in 2020 by the Centre for Mental Health. This focuses upon not just societal inequalities, but inequalities within the mental health system itself, which many people perhaps are unaware of, but it certainly is an unequal environment for lots of different reasons. I would love to expand upon, but I do not have time to expand upon this evening, so I can't. I'm going to have to be really disciplined. Another Michael Marmot publication, Building Back Fairer, a document, again, with a very powerful and persuasive evidence base attached to it. This one focuses upon pre-existing inequalities, but also the additional impact upon inequalities of the COVID pandemic. So again, an important recent publication. And then I'm just going to end by referencing the fact that this year's World Mental Health Day on October the 10th is very much on theme. The theme is mental health in an unequal world. So again, we're continuing with the theme of inequality. And as a socially minded mental health professional, I'm gratified to see that at last the spotlight being shone upon a really important issue. There's a very, very serious contributory factor to the level of mental health issues that we see in our society. So my final point is a reference to the current government's agenda in relation to this levelling up. Are we doing that? And should we be? I see no evidence that we are actually doing that at present. So the government claims to be working on it. It is important to recognize it's the work of at least a generation or more, potentially. So it's an incredibly complex, time-consuming, costly agenda, but the rewards would be amazing, I believe, if we were to be serious about addressing that issue. Should we be leveling up? Again, I'm equally categorical, absolutely, definitely, without a doubt. And I'll explain why. So I talked about the academic publications in the field, which are incredible and compelling and very, very well evidenced in terms of the societal impact of inequality. And now I'll give you some specific examples of what I mean by that, all based upon very, very recent data. Normally, this is where I would ask you questions. This is a perfect opportunity for me to ask you questions, to communicate a sense of scale and just get your perspective on it. But again, I can't do that tonight. I may do it, maybe I'll do it in relation to one of the questions. Maybe I won't, because I know we're time limited. So what is the consequence of everything I just discussed? What are the costs and how do they manifest themselves in our society and our system? Again, very, very recent stats here. The first one coming from NHS Digital, a quite staggering conclusion. And every time I say it, I'm still staggered that it's true, but it is true. I've seen it in the mental health system. The impact of inequalities on Black people. There are many ways in which we can measure this, but one is the simple and the stark fact that a Black person is 4 times more likely to be subject to a mental health order than a white person is to enter the mental health system than a white person, which is extraordinary, really. In terms of the impact of people upon benefits, again, I've seen this for myself because one of the other things I did was to commission mental health services across Wales, specifically of people who've been unemployed for a long time, to help them overcome the psychological impact of that. When it comes to people on benefits, they are, according to some studies, at least 60% are likely to have some kind of recognizable mental health issue. When it comes to the poorest fifth of the population, they are 4 times more likely to develop some kind of, general mental health issue. Likewise, for young people in the lowest income bracket, 4.5 times more likely. There are other ways in which inequalities manifest themselves too. One is in relation to general life expectancy. When we make comparisons between the most affluent and the most deprived, those differences in life expectancy are really stark. On average, they represent, for a man, about 10 years, and for a woman, for a man about around 11 years, and for a woman around 8 years. And again, I'm talking about averages there. There are individual instances where the different life expectancies in those different communities are even more stark. And it's not 11 years, it's 15 years or more. The cost of mental health issues to the UK as a whole, this is where I'm tempted to ask you a question. So I need to have a sip of tea. I'm just going to ask you one question during this conversation, and this will be it. Anyone who wants to unmute themselves and have a guess is more than welcome to do so. So I will throw this open while I have some tea and lubricate my larynx, and I'll ask you, what do you think mental health issues cost UK society on an annual basis? And these are figures that are pre-COVID, remember, pre-COVID. So when we express a desire to go back to normal, let's remember this was normal. So anyone like to guess in pounds how much mental health issues cost the UK economy in 2018? And there's no obligation, it's just a suggestion.
10 billion.
I'm sorry, what was that?
10 billion.
That's lovely, thank you. That's a good start. But as I usually say at this point, this is where I become like a kind of dark auctioneer, an evil auctioneer. It's higher.
50 billion?
50 billion, we're getting closer to the figure, but it's higher. Shall I give you the answers? You've given me 2 good suggestions already.
100 billion.
Sorry?
100 billion.
100 billion, well, that's close enough. Let's go with that one. That one's close enough. You're slightly higher than the actual figure. The actual figure is 94 billion pounds per annum in 2018. The cost to UK employers alone is, and it's been estimated on several occasions that I'm aware of, is around 40 billion pound plus. So when you add the cost to the education system and the benefit system and the health system and so forth, we reach a figure of around 94 billion pounds, which is astronomical. Why is that happening? Can we go on like that? And this is pre-COVID. Again, none of these situations have got worse. Have got better since then. All of these have got slightly worse. I sometimes ask an audience the next question too, which is prescription levels for antidepressants in the United Kingdom. I'm not going to do that now, again, for reasons of time. The answer, according to NHS Digital Data 2019, is the number of prescriptions issued in the NHS in that year was approximately 71 million. Now, I make no judgment there. People deal with their suffering, their distress in many ways, and I'm not anti-medication by any way, shape or form. I merely throw the fact out there that even though within that figure there are repeat prescriptions and a recognition also that antidepressants are prescribed for things beyond depression, that is still equivalent to a prescription for every single man, woman, and child in the United Kingdom, which is a staggering thing to consider. It's not quite like that. When you take repeat prescriptions out of the picture, you usually find that about 25% of the British population is using some kind of psychiatric medication. And again, I make no judging. That really works for some people. They take it in an informed way, no problem. I'm just giving you a sense of scale. So in the face of all of this evidence, all of this sometimes quite scary data, what can we do? How do we make an association between something like Stoic philosophy and all of this? So I'll attempt to make that connection now. So again, I am an optimist, but I am also a realist. I do not expect systemic change in the near future, even though we desperately need it. But if it's not coming, what can we, especially if we come from disadvantaged communities, what can we do for ourselves and others that costs nothing and means everything? Because that's my definition of well-being, that's my definition of self-care, that's my definition of stoicism, and all those things come together. These are things we can do that cost nothing and mean, if not everything, then they mean a great deal. So in the context of health inequalities, where people do not have free or equal access to services, they do have equal access to practices, and that's where Stoicism comes in. Where does it come in? To a really important space in health strategy terms, the so-called pre-primary space. So in our country, you know, we're very respectful towards the NHS, as we should, because it's a wonderful organization. I worked in it for many years, and I'm very proud of that fact. But we can't expect the health system to solve all of our problems. We need something beyond that. We need to create a healthier culture to offset some of these very, very serious social issues. Where will that happen? In the so-called pre-primary space. Where is that? It's here now. It's here in our little community now. It's in every school. It's in every university. It's in every community setting. It's in every household. It's what happens before people enter the health system. That's where that space is. One of the great Stoics, Seneca, offered a description of a similar space. He was talking about the role of philosophy in people's lives, which is very similar to my conception. And he asked people to imagine a hospital without any doctors, where people sit on their beds and discuss the symptoms of their common affliction, life, and share remedies for that affliction. The self-care space, the pre-primary space, is exactly that. Oh, so I've gone backwards now, haven't I? Yeah. So what can we do? How can Stoicism fit in a practical way? I spent most of my time talking about the context, because that was the important part, a really important part for me to communicate. I'll spend less time on this because I'm sure there is a degree of understanding of Stoicism and Stoic practices in the room already. But I'd like to expand upon them slightly and suggest some Stoic practices that can help to cultivate what I describe as self-care qualities. So we all know self-care is important, but that doesn't mean we do it. And there are all sorts of complicated reasons why that is the case. When it comes to people from deprived or disadvantaged communities, and I am from one, so I know what I'm talking about. This is my background I'm talking about, as well as the background of millions of other people. There is an issue with self-care. I think it boils down to this, that people who don't care about themselves are unlikely to take care of themselves. It's a really obvious thing. And so many people in so many communities in our country are given reasons to not to like themselves, to actively dislike themselves, to indulge in self-blame, and then for that to turn into this kind of slow suicide of self-destruction. That's what we're talking about often here. I made a reference to a psychiatrist called Frantz Fanon, who did a lot of work in this area. And he coined a phrase which is really relevant to what I just talked about. Oppressed people always believe the worst about themselves, and they absolutely do. But the dangerous thing is they act upon that belief. And that's what leads to some of the stats we saw in the previous slides. So again, what can we do in response to this? How can Stoicism help? How can it liberate people from the psychological impact of inequality, the sense of inferiority and incapacity that is instilled in people as a result of that experience? There are some things we can do, I think, to boost people's inclination and capacity to self-care by focusing upon key things like self-awareness, self-esteem, self-control, self-transcendence. Does Stoicism give us the tools to boost those qualities? In my opinion, which everyone is free to challenge, yes, it does. So adverse experiences erode those qualities and make us less inclined to self-care. How do we build them back up again through a Stoic perspective, Stoic practices? That's my question. I can offer a couple of examples in relation to each. Clearly, there are several practices here. But how does Stoicism help? What does it teach us? What does it encourage us to do? I should mention, of course, that this is an image of Socrates. Not strictly speaking a Stoic, as everyone knows, but hugely influential over Stoic thought and Stoic practice, and hugely influential for me. And one of the things that Socrates encouraged us to do, and Stoicism encourages us to do, is to live consciously, to be really aware of not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it, to find as much meaning as we can in life. Why is that important? Well, it's a theme that runs through the work of Socrates and the modern work of people like the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl or the positive psychologist Martin Seligman, all of whom emphasize the importance of meaning. Frankl in particular was quite pithy in terms of describing its importance. One of the many wise things he said was this: that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment you find the meaning. So finding meaning in our suffering can alleviate the symptoms of it and allow us to develop a more positive relationship with the source of our suffering and improve our lives. What other perspectives that come from Stoicism are helpful in increasing our level of self-awareness, making us more aware, for example, of the risk factors that exist in some of our life choices, encouraging us to avoid harmful life choices through the Stoic virtue, through the practice of the Stoic virtue, temperance, moderation in all things. If we're tempted to make a choice that is risky, that is potentially harmful, Stoicism asks us to consider how we'll feel afterwards if we take that course of action. And in reflecting upon that feeling, we may be less inclined to make that choice. Sources of self-esteem. This is such a big issue, such an important aspect of work in the field. I've seen so many people just plagued by low self-esteem in the mental health system and in deprived communities. It really is a plague, but it's not described as such, but it truly is. How does Stoicism help boost levels of self-esteem? In really practical ways. It encourages us to build our self-esteem upon things that will always be with us, that we will not necessarily lose, at least until the day we die, when, of course, everything comes to an end, which is a natural process. But in our society, we're not asked to do that. We're encouraged to build our self-esteem upon things that A, we can lose, or B, we may lose. And that simply isn't wise. So if we base all of our self-esteem upon looking youthful, or being youthful rather, on our looks, superficial things that will inevitably decline during the life course, what happens to our self-esteem then? What if we base it upon material abundance, upon our level of wealth? What happens if we lose that wealth, if we lose that abundance? Where is our self-esteem then? So Stoicism encourages us to base our self-esteem upon other things, such as our conduct, to indulge in pro-social behavior, for example. And it's interesting, it did that so very, very long ago, and yet pro-social behavior is a subject of study these days, and in some scientific studies, a link has been made between consistent or persistent pro-social behavior and an improved and more effective immune system. In the context of what we're experiencing in present, that's quite an interesting finding. Another hot topic, control. Clearly, we've seen some scenes in our society recently where people have lost control in ways that are entirely understandable. Again, no judgment here. But the Stoics asked us to reflect upon things such as anger, different ways in which we can lose our control, to reflect upon what happens and how we feel after we lose control in our lives. Guilty, remorseful, we may commit an act that is criminal in nature, and then we're penalized or punished for that, and we carry that throughout our lives. So self-control is incredibly important. And yet, from the scenes we've seen at petrol stations throughout the country over the last few days, you wouldn't think so. Again, one of the great Stoics, Seneca, asked us to reflect upon anger, reminding us that it's a temporary form of insanity, and it absolutely, categorically is. And he also reflected upon the fact that lots of anger comes from a sense of injury. We feel we've been wounded in some way. Our egos have been wounded in some way. We've been disrespected. But that's a perception. We can challenge and reject that perception because it isn't really true. It's how we choose to feel about a situation. It's not really representative of the situation itself. Recognizing that allows us to maintain control of ourselves and avoid doing things that could be harmful to ourselves or harmful to other people. How else can we increase the level of self-control through the use of Stoicism? Lots of exercises referred to here. The fundamental focus upon control, the dichotomy of control. What can we control and what is beyond our control? Absolutely at the heart of Stoicism. And the answer, generally speaking, is our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. Why is it important to recognize that? Because if we pour our energy into those things, we're spending that energy, that time, those vital resources wisely, well. If we pour our energy into a contemplation of things that are beyond our control, we are potentially wasting that time, wasting that energy. So it's a really fundamentally important thing to recognize. Okay. I am very keen to finish on time. So again, I'm only going to reference a couple of perspectives here. A final, really important, I think, perspective that comes from Stoicism, but you also see reflected in schools of psychology, like positive psychology and humanistic psychology, is self-transcendence. The idea, the recognition that sometimes the self is too much for us and we need to escape it, and it can be really, really healthy to do that. How do we do that? The most effective way I've found is through service to other people, because that's my duty as a human being. That's why I'm here. That's why I exist. And I think that's true of us all. Whether we choose to recognize that or not is entirely up to us. But that perspective is reflected within the work of one of the great Stoics, again, Marcus Aurelius, who reminded himself every day when he was struggling to engage with his responsibilities as an emperor, today I have work to do as a human being. And you see that same perspective reflected in perspectives that come from completely different sources, like Gandhi, for example. And his perspective on that was to find yourself, first lose yourself in service to others. It's exactly the same perspective, expressed slightly differently. But as human beings, and I think we maybe found this in the early days of the pandemic when we were connecting with each other and supporting each other, we derived a great deal of satisfaction from that. We're in a different time now, sadly, but I wouldn't like us to lose that sense of community, which is another way through which we achieve self-transcendence, through the Stoic concept of oikeiosis, a sense of community, of affinity with others, and not just other people, other living things, extending to include, the creatures that are, I think, unfortunate enough to share the planet with us and the planet itself. So there's even an environmental dimension to Stoicism. But again, these practices, each and every one of these practices can help to address the profound and the painful consequences, psychological consequences of being made to feel unequal, inferior. Stoicism can slowly start to correct some of that damage and change people's perspectives and make them more positive. So I would say ultimately that Stoicism is itself a form of transcendence. It creates a healthy space between us and the madness of the world. So what is the point of all this? What do we gain from doing these things? We've alluded to some of that already, but I'd also say there are distinct psychological benefits or rewards from practicing as a Stoic. And I wouldn't put these down if I hadn't experienced each and every one of them myself as a result of these perspectives, of these wonderful practices, these wise practices. Some more positive emotions and increased contentment, I can definitely tick that box. Fewer negative emotions, reduced frequency and intensity of negative emotions, For me, absolutely. More positive relationships with others. Why? Because we have a more positive relationship with ourselves. Self-acceptance, being content with who we are and where we are right now, because this is where happiness exists in this moment. But in our world, we're encouraged to look forward in time and make our happiness dependent upon something we may possess in the future, something we may do in the future. Well, the future may have other ideas, so it's best to focus our attention upon the present. I won't go through each and every one of these, but those are particularly meaningful to me. So certainly feeling more autonomous and independent in terms of my mastery of events, as much as I'm able to master events and skills and so forth, but also a strong sense of connection with others and being part of a community much greater than me, which is a wonderful feeling. And ultimately, yeah, personal growth, sense of meaning and purpose, greater engagement in life, greater satisfaction in life. All of these are rewards that can be earned through good practice. I should say that Stoicism is one form of good practice. Others are available. There are other spiritual products out there or philosophical products out there that can do some of the same things. However, they all borrowed heavily from Stoicism, often without acknowledgement. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some pretty dark stuff, but hopefully dark stuff at a societal level, at a high level, and working our way down from that to the impact of good self-care practices informed by Stoic philosophy upon individuals. So hopefully you've got a sense of my background and my interests. I certainly talked about the scale of inequalities that exist in our society. I've tried to very, very briefly hint at how Stoicism can help to offset some of the psychological impact of inequalities. I just briefly reflected upon the psychological rewards of Stoic self-care. I talked about different dimensions of self-care, and now I can stop talking, I can sip tea, you can ask me questions if you choose to do so. If you'd rather not, that's also fine. Thank you very much for listening.